My grandmother's church refused to visit her even on her deathbed and demanded that she put them in her will, so she set them up with a 1-2 punch. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights and was very active in supporting home missions, as well as helping with other youth programs. She always tithed, and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of Big White Church youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73, when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, Roldan, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Roldan was too busy, but Eric, another pastor, stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, with my grandma literally on her deathbed, Grandma, Grandpa, and Eric discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then Eric started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly, this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then Eric steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. Eric would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs and heavenly rewards, where your treasure is your heart will be also. My grandma started crying. She rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, former Marine sergeant, and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed Eric and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Roldan and Eric were conspicuously absent. There were no professional Christians, from Big White Church, at the service at all, not even in the audience. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50+ years, and had worked hard and lived modestly. But it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. The reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit, extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa, that Grandma's will contain some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see Roldan and Eric from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that Roldan and Eric sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these two preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed to more than overflowing room before the entire meeting was over, because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. Grandpa was first beneficiary listed in the will, but, after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s. Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece and nephew received a little more. Then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to Big White Church. Roldan and Eric were, almost, the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the Big White Church and preachers part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to Big White Church, Roldan and Eric, M's, Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. "For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me, come to visit me or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many, many years. But when I needed you in your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit. When I was dying, I invited Roldan to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still love dearly even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear Roldan preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But Roldan couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. Eric came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. Eric did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, Big White Church. This amount was, named the amount, an enormous SHT load of money, generating muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me, but I felt badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as Roldan and Eric, so I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to Big White Church to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely, and no longer able to work my ass off for them, for free, like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to Eric, 1 cent. Bequest to Roldan, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The Roldan and Eric sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud, but we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a charity called Black Charity. Then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we could tell that Roldan and Eric knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal." Every eye in the room was now fixated on Roldan and Eric. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from Big White Church. They ran a free food/clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, Big White Church, which was, and still is 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to Black Charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because Black Charity was practicing the social gospel, while Big White Church was preaching the true gospel. Big White Church even sued to try to get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled and very little money actually changed hands. But, this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why Big White Church, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity. Those N-word were getting uppity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time, but they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everyone, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But Roldan and Eric obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, Roldan and Eric had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings, whom you hate, disrespect and have mistreated, are better people than you are, so they deserve my money more than you do." Having allowed time for everyone to observe Roldan and Eric while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity, and how they and their church had treated our grandma, the lawyer said, "The amount is." Then he named the exact same amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will.